There's nothing I love talking about more than storytelling. It is obviously at the heart of what we do with Atmos. It is at the heart of what makes us human. And we're so honored to be here on the ancestral lands of the Wampanoag people, the original storytellers of this land, and to really co-create this weekend together. I think all experiences that we share, even those that are not written on a page or watched on a screen, they are stories that we are living together. And this is a moment in time for humanity and for this planet. And that is a story in and of itself that we'll get into. And it's one that we are all co-authoring together in every single moment. So thank you for being here. Thank you for bringing your stories to this room. Thank you for being part of this particular story. So with that in mind, stories are so at the heart of what makes us human. And I would love to hear, Bonnie, kind of in your own words, what does storytelling mean to you? What does it mean to you to be a storyteller?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you so much for everyone that was involved in putting this together, and just I'm really grateful to be a visitor to these lands, and I have been a visitor to these lands for the last 10 years of living in this country. So that's really deeply changed who I am as a person and the stories that I feel called to tell, mainly because most of the time I'm really a listener, I think, first and foremost, in the way that I feel like authors begin as readers. I feel like most of the time I'm truly listening more, I think, than telling stories, and that's really important to me, especially when it comes to climate stories and voices on the front lines, and the platform that I have as a storyteller. Like, I've always known that my role has been to listen, essentially, and to communicate those stories in a way that I feel will connect to others. And I think that just is like a general skill of like being a human being, to sort of really connect with people and to hear their unique perspectives, and what they bring to the table, and how you can, I'm always just fascinated to sort of comprehend and how best do I use language to amplify and share that beyond the space I'm in. And I feel as a storyteller, so far I've gone through really different mediums. Obviously, I started as an actor at the age of 9 years old, when I didn't really know what acting was or what storytelling was or who I wanted to be. I think every day at 9 years old, you're changing your mind about who you want to be. And I think that really helped me actually as a 9-year-old actor, because I kind of was truly present to the experience I had as a storyteller from an acting perspective. I wasn't really aware of my body at that time. I hadn't even been through puberty. Like I was like truly just being there and like having an incredible time. And I, was one small piece to a very, very big story. And what I most learned as a small piece to that story that obviously has touched millions of people's lives, was that those films were what they were because of all the other stories happening every day behind the scenes of the crew, and how they were just so part of the story to me, even though we often only celebrate those that we see in front of the camera. Mm. So I learned a lot about collaborative storytelling from a young age, and how there's just no story without sort of conversation, and how acting at the end of the day is about reacting, and that kind of like energy passing between people is just really what story is to me. And I think often when I feel disconnected to the storyteller in me is often when I've spent too much time on my own. Which I think we can all do in this world that can feel quite isolating. And I think I always catch myself sort of like drifting from my skill that I love when I haven't been in community. So this weekend has been really incredible to like just bring alive that within me, and how different like this conversation would be if it was at the beginning of this weekend as opposed to it being now. Like every story I've heard and every person I've met is going to massively, vastly change like how I feel in this moment. And I just love that that like I've evolved in some way. And I think just to throw that back to you, I feel like what's fun in that kind of shape-shifting way as a storyteller is we're constantly transforming and an idea we can have today could be different tomorrow, and being like open and vulnerable to that change. And I would just love to hear in your own writing and even putting on an event like this, like how you've transformed or shifted in your role as a writer, journalist, and editor.
Well, first of all, I just want to say I love the idea of stories as energy being exchanged. I think that's a really beautiful definition. And, you know, it makes me think about the fact that stories, I think, are always, in some way or another, they're vehicles for empathy. In some ways, they're the greatest technology that we have when it comes to empathy. It allows people to put themselves in each other's shoes and experiences. And there's something so beautiful about that. And I loved when we were talking earlier about, you know, the fact that this is our last talk for the weekend, and the fact that it's pulling in all of the other different elements throughout the weekend and what might have changed if this was first. And for me, one of the greatest gifts of this weekend has been hearing people reference and pull in each other's panels and talks, because that's how it becomes a collaborative story. And, you know, I think I shared something, maybe it was Friday night, about speaking about identity and how, right, I'm a human being, but I also contain all these other species within me, microbes and bacteria and viruses that keep me alive. But I was having a conversation once with Dr. Suzanne Simard, who is really one of the first forest ecologists who discovered that, or was able to prove through the language of Western science, that forests are and trees are kind of these reciprocal beings and tied together through mycelial networks. And she shared with me this idea that perhaps our personalities are also amalgamations of all the stories that we've been told, and all of the ideas that have been shared. And I love that idea of people as being collections of stories, because I think that really speaks to what you're pointing towards, of how as storytellers we are also shapeshifters, because that story is constantly changing. It's constantly evolving based on the experiences we have, the other storytellers we interact with. And I think I've found a lot in my life, and it's really been about giving myself that permission to transform and to change in how I tell my own story, in the stories that I tell, in the mediums I work in, which I know is a part of your journey as well. Yeah, I think, you know, in some ways, I always wanted to do what I do now. Like, literally, when I was 5 years old, I told my mom I wanted to grow up and be the editor-in-chief of an environmental magazine.
Woo!
Extremely.
It's happening.
Yeah. I mean, extremely specific. I did also say I wanted to have a pet jaguar, which has not happened.
Could still happen.
Yeah, maybe but
shouldn't.
maybe shouldn't.
Yeah.
Worked out for the best. But anyway, so in some ways this makes perfect sense, and also it's been such an evolution. I mean, the last talk that we got to hear with Cameron and Camila, it was very meaningful to me. My career started in fashion, what I was writing about. I was a music journalist for a while. I mean, it shape-shifted so many times over the course of my career. And this moment right now is, I see all of those threads kind of being woven together in the stories I'm fortunate enough to tell with Atmos. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I love that. Something that comes up for me immediately, kind of in what you shared, is this journey you've had from kind of in front of the camera to behind the camera. And I'm just curious what you really learned about storytelling in that process.
Yeah, I guess for me, the moment of stepping behind the camera was also in my education, in the sense that when I went to college, I decided, rather than go to drama school, which I guess I could have done, I decided to go to film school, and I majored in directing and writing, and I was really, really at that moment, and still am, very much more interested in sort of the behind the camera position as a storyteller. And to me, it was incredibly important that I put myself back amongst my peers. I feel, whilst what was fabulous about Harry Potter was we're all children being children, and I didn't lose that playfulness and my chance at growing up. But at the same time, the filmmakers and the crew I was around were obviously much more my kind of elders and seniors in that space. So to me, it was really important to go to film school. And I think it almost feels like it was kind of this way you either do sometimes what your parents say or you do the opposite. And to me, it kind of felt like this little, to me, sort of like this moment of revolution against that space that I had kind of found myself in through luck, choice, the universe, who knows. But I decided that I would kind of make that more conscious choice to go behind the camera and own that as my own choice and space and decision. And it's been like an interesting thing for me, because last year was actually the first time I kind of stepped back in front of the camera in a totally different way. And last year I made a non-scripted TV show that is essentially an extension of my book, Go Gently, but it's a TV show that follows myself and Pattie Gonia on a trip through the west coast of America, which you lovely are in Willow as well. And so it was just so fun to step back in front of the camera 10 plus years later in a totally different way, where I was just being myself and telling the story of something I deeply care about, which is our planet. And it was just really fun to realize that you never need to close a door for something. Like, I feel like I thought when I stopped acting, I had to like close this door of that part of me as a storyteller. But really, it was just always there if I wanted to go to it. But at that moment, it didn't quite serve my progression and evolution as a person. And I loved going through some other spaces before coming back to being in front of the camera again in my own terms, I guess. But yeah, I feel like I wouldn't direct the work that I've directed if I hadn't been an actor. Like, having been directed as an actor, I know that there are so many ways to direct, and that's what's so incredible about it. And I feel like that language that one can have as a director too, and with your actors or performers, is just so special, and like the words you use are so important in those kind of really high energy moments. And I am so pleased that that's the way in which I've come to be the storyteller I am, because I just learned, it gave me the foundation of my life before I went to school. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that I've realized that it's not a one-way street, and I can kind of go back and forth and like, you know, what is in front, behind the camera, you know, sure. Just kind of question those places.
And what do you, I guess, what was was there a specific moment that made you decide to use your love of storytelling and apply that to climate specifically?
Yeah, I feel like for so long I like separated the two. I felt like there was like advocacy work I was doing, and then the stories I was telling in my own sort of short films and music videos and commercials I was doing. And then I realized like that I was kind of neglecting like bringing the two together. And I think a big moment in grappling with how I'm going to do that is like jumping between kind of the non-fictional and fictional space, to me, is always something that I like think about daily, because I come from real like fiction space, and like I love reading, but I have like some kind of vulnerabilities around really stepping into that power as a storyteller from that space. And like I've got so much more to learn to feel confident in that space as a kind of fictional storyteller. So yeah, I guess for me, the reason why I joined the two together is because I feel like there are so many great people out there who are telling stories, I think, through journalism or through their activism, and they're truly on the front lines of these issues. But I think really when I sit and think about where my skills lie, like I do tend toward, you know, fictional storytelling and that suspension of disbelief and that environment that you can put people in that incubator of a kind of a cinema, of a movie theater, is just so powerful to me. And I think I'll always go back to that space as a place that I understand most. And I personally feel so at home in a dark room in a movie theater. And I feel like touching a bit actually what like was spoken about yesterday in the keynote, this idea of companionship. I think to me as a storyteller, and even people I've, you know, have the pleasure to meet that obviously know me through Harry Potter, and they found genuine companionship in those stories that has been there for them in really dark moments. And to be a small part of that light that story brought to them in their life is like, it never gets old when people tell me that. And so I think stories have so much more power than we think to be true companions for people in whatever place they could be in their life. And that's why, to me, like, I would like to, in the years to come, push myself further into kind of the fictional storytelling space, and bringing climate into that story as a way to, you have this moment, as I said, in the movie theater where you can be in a very malleable, watery, open, vulnerable space, and you can present an idea to someone who could be quite fixed on what they think of the world, and change it and shift it. And like, for one brief moment, they could be, you know, open to what seemed impossible to them. And I think that is like very, very powerful and magical to be able to like be in that space. So that's where like I see true like change and shifting like able to happen from a storytelling perspective. Beautiful.
I think, you know, I learned recently that people and our brains are wired to be, it's 22 times more likely for us to remember a story than a fact, which is ironically a fact that I keep remembering. But I think it really highlights the fact that we are creatures of story. And I think when we do engage in being told a story and really opening ourselves to that, it is a really porous experience. It's an experience where we allow ourselves to be malleable, and it allows us to be changed. And I loved what you were sharing around bringing fiction into the conversation, because Neil Gaiman once said, I'm going to paraphrase this, but fiction is how we tell truths through lies. And something that I've always loved, because I think we have this idea that any story that isn't real, it's fabricated, or in some ways it's fantastical. But so many of the threads in the stories that we are told and that we tell are really the same. And the fact that they speak to all of us so much, it shows, or it shines a light on, I think, the universality of what it is to be human. And I'm personally very excited to see you apply climate to that. I think we need more climate fiction storytelling. It's something that we do with Atmos from time to time, and I love being able to kind of blend the two. And
I think we're also coming out of a time when a lot of stories that have brought in sort of climate stories have often been sort of like, you know, dystopian kind of society, you know, crumbling at the face of like the situation. So I'm very interested in like, how do you bring in these sort of hopeful, radical imaginations of the future we're all here trying to work towards? How do you bring those stories in but still have friction and tension? Because if it was happily ever after and this like beautiful place we told us stories, I'm sure like people wouldn't love that story either. Like we all do actually, we want friction, and we need there to be sort of like obstacles in the way, because that is what true life is. So like I'm in a moment where I'm like, how do you bring in these worlds we're here building, but still bring in tension and friction to those?
I think about that a lot when I watch nature documentaries, because I think there's always this tension between whether it's planet Earth or whatnot. I'm always kind of wondering, is the episode going to be fully just look how beautiful this planet is and look at these different species and look how they can thrive when we leave it alone? Or is David Attenborough going to come in and let us know how those species are endangered and bring it to that place? And it's like, I never know how I want to feel about it, because when it doesn't come in, I'm also like, okay, but we're not going to talk about how it's threatened. But then when it does, it also...
You're like, oh no,
right.
I just wanted to watch this beautiful moment. Yeah.
Exactly. In talking about this thread of kind of the universality of storytelling, we were at dinner the other night, and Bonnie shared something with me that I'd never heard before, which is that there are actually only 7 types of stories. There are only like 7 stories that we tell, and these archetypes kind of just shapeshift on their own and take all of these different forms. So I'm going to share what those 7 are. Overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, and my personal favorite, rebirth. So this will be a little bit of an experiment, and yeah, but we just kind of wanted to talk about those, and I'm curious, like, in what way in which of these archetypes do you see the story of climate playing out? And how can it be helpful perhaps for us to understand the story of climate, the story of what we are authoring right now, or what is being authored for us rather, what is being authored upon the earth? How does it fit into some of these molds or stories in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of them, right? I mean, if we sat, you could think of something that fit all of those 7 archetype stories, and a hybrid of some and others, and you know, some we could have more problems with personally. Like, we're going to be all drawn to like some stories that we prefer, and maybe some that we need more of. Do we need more comedy within this space? Do we need, like, we know there's tragedy, and we know maybe we could probably name some of the monsters in the space, and you know, again, referencing yesterday, like, to welcome in the monster, the trickster, like, is incredibly important. I feel like, yeah, I guess I think there's just all of them, and I think in moments it's interesting sometimes when we talk about all these things, it can be massively overwhelming. And what was said earlier by Max was like, if we all look in the mirror and we see for a moment, just try and sit with ourselves and see like what our skills are. I feel like I personally have been doing that recently, or I feel like we can sometimes get I have been thinking too much maybe about like the experiences I've had or who I am as a person, and actually really disconnecting with the skills I have and how there's stories within those skills, because those skills have either been passed down to me or I've learnt them, or that's just... So I just, in that idea of looking in the mirror, like, is there a story in this moment and how you relate to the climate crisis that you're like personally on? If you're imagining like you're the leading role of your life, however individual I know that can sound, but like we are, you know, in our bodies of like, we are telling our story every day. And so I think as I think about that and how they relate to the climate, I think in moments or in situations, one could use that as a tool or a method to try and comprehend what's going on in that moment, or who you are in that story. Like in a tragedy, like, who are you? And like, who is the tragedy genuinely happening to in this moment as the climate comes closer to our own doorstep? But like, for me in this moment, that tragedy is not a lived daily experience, unlike it is for many other people in this world. So like, where do I fit in that tragedy of a story? So I think it's just always interesting, like, who are your characters and which character are you, is always an interesting way I think you can look at archetypal stories.
Yeah. And I think also, you know, something I'm often reflecting on is, I think when I see apathy or people not necessarily wanting to engage with the climate crisis, I think about the fact that as a culture, we are so obsessed with these stories of heroic journeys and quests and overcoming the monster and everything else in which there is some monstrous villain or big bad and the hero must save the day. And I'm always somewhat perplexed by the fact that in some ways we are living this story. And, you know, I think we often put ourselves in the shoes of the stories that we watch and consume, and that's the element of fantasy, right? Is we imagine ourselves as these characters, and we are living in the most important story in some ways in modern history of our planet. And so I love the idea of asking what role can we play? What characters can we be in that story?
And I think too, in most stories, I always think, like when you watch a story, like why did they choose to start that story today? When you think about fictional, like what was that character doing 10 minutes before the film began? And why in all films does the first main piece happen in the first 10 minutes? If you look at any film, the main moment that sets you up for the whole rest of the story happens most of the time in the first 10 minutes, on the 10th minute, often around that kind of time. So like for us, like, and when you're telling stories, you need urgency. Like that's why you told the story today, because today something happened that called that character into an urgent scenario. And I think that's true to the way we need to look at this. Like we are at that 10th, we are past the 10th minute, and like what's our urgency to telling that story? And like how can we bring that kind of energy as a storyteller is really important to me in a way that isn't too it uses the right language, not in a way that is shameful, like not in a way that kind of makes people think like, oh, you're not part of this movement, like why not yet? Like that's never the way I would come to this space of talking to people and wanting to include them. And Michaela touched on it yesterday, like no one would want to join this movement if we all didn't look like we were having a good time. So how do you like make the story of the movement what it is, which is like incredibly galvanizing and energetic, and like how do you bring that kind of like energy into the story so it like the stakes are high, which they are obviously.
Yeah, beautifully said. It also makes me think about how important context is for stories, right? It's also, I mean, not just the journey of the character where it's coming at them with their lives, but where in human culture is the story coming. And it's obviously always so interesting to see how stories evolve in the time and the context in which they come out. But I'm thinking about this in relationship too to the story of the climate crisis and the fact that when we step out of human timescales and we think about geologic time and the fact that humans are really so nascent on this planet, and it shifts how you look at all of it, right? And that is the power of stepping outside of even our conception of human storytelling, is when we can see beyond kind of our species and our species story, right? And how can storytelling become collaborative, not just with humans, with each other, but multi-species collaborations? Yeah,
and I think that sort of love for deep time that we obviously both have, and again, like just think things in our lifetime that have changed, when often it feels like impossible for things to change, or this world we imagine to come through. Like there are things in my lifetime that like my parents probably never thought would happen, and as I am now a mother myself, like that's like I'm watching time totally take on a new meaning, in the sense of like literally I don't know what time has been the past 8 months of being a mum, or the months before that I was carrying my child. Like I'm suddenly like thinking about time in like a whole different way. I think particularly when a baby is so young, my son is so young, you start like measuring everything in weeks, which is just like wild. When like someone's child is someone's life is a few weeks. It's like blown my mind when it comes to like deep time and moments, and like with him and the sense of storytelling, as I'm bringing the books out, reading them to him, like I'm beginning to fill his cup of stories, and like what responsibility that is to be reading those stories. And some I'll like catch myself midway through a sentence and be like, I don't know if this one will read, because you just, some books that I read as a child, like I would say are not quite right in the stance that they've taken. And it's just been a really interesting moment to catch myself. And whilst he's obviously not reading or speaking right now, like that it is like that they are making an impact. So it's just been like a whole new world for me in this past couple of months, just like imagination and story and play, like that's now taking on this whole new like place for me, and it's I think really like helping me as a storyteller.
Well, and it's interesting also because I think I'm going to make a conjecture here, I don't know if this is true, but I would imagine that humans are consuming more stories now than like a day than we ever have in history, right? I mean, there's so many micro stories that we're all experiencing, we're scrolling through, we're stepping in and out of at all times. And yeah, I mean, how do you contain that? I can't even imagine as a parent. Obviously, you're not there yet since he's not reading yet, but it's interesting to think about, and especially in the trajectory of the future. Will that increase? Will it decrease the amount of stories we...
Yeah, and like, boundary of storytelling. Like, I'm not gonna, like, I want him to feel like his world is limitless, like in that sense. But at the same time, you're gonna like feel these boundaries of maybe society that's been put on you, or parenting of how I've been parented. Like, it's like an interesting place, and it kind of reminds me a little bit about what we were talking about the other night, this idea that are there some stories that we can have within ourselves that actually don't need to be told. And I think told to ourselves, or maybe don't need to be recorded too. Like obviously there are many cultures that don't believe that recording story data, whatever it could be, is actually, it could reduce the energy of that story. And like, as you say, we're consuming so many stories, but like they can just go in one ear and out the other. Like, how do we bring like real reverence back to the story and the gravitas to that story? And that's a piece of someone. If they tell you something, that's a real, like, could be this real vulnerable moment that they've told us that story, and we're just flipping through it like it's kind of nothing. And this is why it's so important, like, as we're here today, like sharing space, like how can we return to that kind of like oral storytelling is always something that I'm interested in and exploring in that kind of performance way, potentially. I don't know.
Yeah, it makes me think about also, particularly when we're talking about the boundaries of it and kind of where the story, it makes me think of where the story starts and stops, and our interaction with it begins and ends. It's making me think of a friend of mine who is also an actor, and was telling me once about a show they were in on Broadway that dealt with mental health and suicidality. And she was sharing that so often they would get people after the shows coming up and saying, this really helped me process, this really healed me. And they actually had training from a psychologist come in and share that it's really important that people understand that stories are the beginning, can be in so many ways the beginning point of healing, which is the first step, right? It's crucial as a first step. We watch a story, or we read a story, we experience a story, and we have these light bulbs, right? Because we see ourselves in the characters and they cause us to have revelations. But she was sharing that the psychologist told them, but there's a crucial second step, which is acting upon that revelation. And it makes me think about storytelling regarding the earth and our relationship with the earth and the climate crisis. How do you, as a storyteller, encourage people to not just have the experience of reading or watching and listening and learning about the earth, but also creating action from experiencing those stories? And I'm thinking particularly about your book, Go Gently. It offers so many ways to create actionable change in people's lives. And kind of how did you approach that, and how do you hold that?
Yeah, I feel like all the time we can be moved by things, but not really know what to do with our feelings or emotions or anger, potentially. And it's sometimes hard to know what that should look like. Like, should it just be, a click this petition now and, resolve how you just felt towards that situation? Or does that reduce it as well? Because, like, you actually could need more support than that to process that moment. And I also think, segueing slightly, like when it comes to the light bulb moment or seeing yourself in a character, it's so incredibly important, I think, to me and to everyone, that it's really important that we make sure that there are people playing the roles and the characters that everyone of this world can identify with, and that's really important. And that was really important to me when I wrote my book, that I brought in other voices into that book, and there are people that I interview in that book, so that if you're reading my book, even though it's very much through my personal experience, you could easily not identify with anything in me and my words, but you read one interview within that book and you're like, oh my gosh, yeah, that person speaks to me more, and that was really important to me. So I think that's really important in all storytelling, that we create those roles and we allow those storytellers to tell those stories. But yeah, going back to the action piece, I think I don't know what the answer is, and I think it's an interesting thing when I think about the TV show that I just made. Like, obviously, I hope that that's just the beginning for some of the audience, that sparks something in the beginning of their journey. And like, as is my book is just a tiny beginning, was its intention. And so what does that look like? I often wonder, like, in the sense that we all, when you have a website or you're Netflix and you're a streaming network, you're trying to keep people on your platform, right? People don't want to lose people to like click here and you go to another website. So like, how do you integrate technology to keep people in these spaces, but to take action beyond the space? And I don't know if any platform has quite figured that out yet, because we're constantly clicking out of these apps and places and stories. And so like, how do we if that's the way we are, like keep that action within that space. Like I don't really know the answer to that, and that's something that I'm trying to think of for the TV show that I've made, because it's so important to me that every person that we shared space with for that show and we're amplifying and talking to, I want them to have the opportunity for connection beyond us recording their story. Like I want other people to be able to connect with those people. So I'm not entirely sure, but I think I work in a way that I personally really like tangible, actionable things to do afterwards. Like I need to know like, and what, otherwise I can literally feel like, blown open and I have absolutely no idea how to put those pieces back together. Like I've been thinking about that this weekend, like, what are my actionable steps, like beyond the conversations I've heard this weekend? And that could be something like interesting that you can each think of, like what is some piece that you're going to take back with you? And it could be, if you're unsure, just telling the story of this weekend to someone back home. That could be a great step. But yeah, I think it's like definitely something I am always working and figuring out. And I think people want to know, but it's all very specific to you. Again, Max said that a little bit with his like, you know what's in your basket, you know who you are as a person. Like often people say to me like, what's one thing I can do for the climate crisis? And I'm like, I literally cannot tell you that. Like I have no idea. If only there was one perfect thing that we could each do. There's like billions and millions, and that's what's just so amazing about it too, because like you can't really complain that there isn't something to do about it. Like there's loads of pathways, and like we each probably can like tap into our pathway.
Absolutely. I think also it reminds me of a thread also from what you shared earlier on listening, and you feeling like you've been in a moment of really storytelling through listening. It made me wonder, I mean, to what extent when you're approaching a story, when any of us are approaching a story, I think about this as a publisher a lot, to what extent are you telling the story versus listening to the story that needs to be told or wants to be told?
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of that idea, I think believing in that like universal energy of being and like things coming around is like, are you just borrowing that story for a moment? And did it land on wherever you write, whether that's a desk, a chair, I don't know, a bed, wherever you may be telling your story from? You know, I'm always thinking like, did that story just come through and land here? And like, I'm figuring out like, am I the right person to tell that story? No, you know, I'm going to let that one sail by. Like, I don't think that's my story. And then another one could land like, oh yeah, I actually think like my understanding of this is something that I could speak to. And then like you sit with that story maybe for a month, a year, and you battle with it, and you're like, you know what, actually I don't think this is my story. But you could have battled with that for like a year, because writing takes a long time. So I always am interested in like how that like kind of energy can come through, and like what you like make of it, and sometimes the medium which is best to tell that story can kind of change, if that kind of answers the question. Yeah.
I'm thinking about also what you were sharing in the response to the previous question. You know, I don't know about anyone else in the room, but I was completely sobbing through the ocean panel this morning, like fully just the entire time. And I was thinking about why, and I mean, there were so many moments on that panel, so many stories shared that were, I mean, from rescuing a crab on the beach to leopard seals teaching Andy how to hunt or wanting to teach how to hunt and gather food. I mean, so many stories were really moving. And also, I think I felt in this moment just that the whole weekend was just kind of coming in and up and out of me. And it made me think about the fact that since we are consuming so many stories all the time, it makes me curious about how much space we're really giving ourselves to process the stories that we are witnessing. And and I wonder if there's something also in giving ourselves that space to sit with the stories and not just jump from one into the next. It reminds me of the strike in the film industry last year, and how all of a sudden there were less TV shows coming out and everyone was like,
What do we do now?
What do I do? Am I going to have to sit with my thoughts? What's happening? And I think I'm curious about the role that slowness can play in storytelling as well.
Yeah, I definitely feel like we don't give ourselves enough time to process, or things are just happening at a pace where it's like you're thrown the next story, as we were saying, before you've even like, wait a minute, I was just like feeling something towards that story. I think it's like, what tools do we have and personal practices do we have to help us to really sit with ourselves, let stories sometimes stir within us in a way that doesn't feel comfortable, in other ways that like make us feel joyous and happy and, you know, laughing out loud, and others that just like break our heart. All those emotions, like giving ourselves space for that and true focus, which I think obviously you find in what you've done at Atmos, in the sense of like long form storytelling. And I think if we write longer stories that take up potentially more time and space to consume, does that like influence how much time we also allow the reader or the audience to digest? And I think like to go against this incredibly short form, just like attention economy idea, like that's really, I think, a big role as a storyteller to challenge your audience through the way that you tell your story, I think, which is why I'm like definitely more personally a consumer of feature-length films than I am of television or of, you know, even shorter forms of things. That's like where I love to be, in that real like 3-hour space storytelling. And I also think like when you go back to the discussion on the oceans today, like when you've got a panel talking about one particular element, like water, like I think like for me, that's always been my element. Like I've loved to be close to the ocean and water in any way that I can. And it has always been a place for me to find inspiration and story. And so like, it's interesting that like that also brings up a lot of emotions and presents these spaces for great stories to be told. But I think when it comes back to like the tools and stuff like that we each have, like I love that I could talk to someone else this weekend and like the woods and the forest and the trees is like their place. And like, whether you can physically go there or not, like how do we sort of like regroup and go to a space that allows us to like digest is like important. And that doesn't always mean that you need to be, you know, we don't have to look much further than like our hands and skin to connect, obviously, with nature. And I think like, yeah, I think it's just, for me, connecting to little tools and tricks that I have. And going through a time as a storyteller, like to not tell any stories, like not through necessary choice, but like in the past 8 months, like I've had nothing to write anything down with because I'm like with my son all the time. So I don't have a pen and paper. I like maybe have my phone, but I haven't had any place to write anything down. And it's been like fascinating because I actually have been, I think, getting to like better places with stories I have in my head because I haven't been writing anything down or like sitting to this idea that we've got to sit at a computer and like write things down. Like that just construct doesn't like really spark creativity always. So it's been like an interesting time of digestion, I think, for me with stories, and like we don't give ourselves that.
Yeah, I completely agree. It makes me think also of when you were sharing about how water is something that always inspires stories for you, right? That's something that's so, in a way, so universal, right? And it speaks to that idea of the universality of storytelling. But it also makes me think about how I completely lost my train of thought. Hold on.
Water came through.
The water came through. Yeah. It was all the water pouring down my face in that particular panel. Oh, okay. I got it again. Okay. It reminds me of how I think I've been having this conversation with a few different people over this weekend about how it feels in a lot of ways like an exhale, because there's something so special and specific about being able to be around other people who understand what you are passionate about who share your values in certain ways, even though we all come from different stories and backgrounds and experiences. There's certain elements here that we all share that have brought us all together. And for me, there's something in the freedom that comes with getting to put down the story of being an environmentalist, right? And our identities are these stories that are so contextual, right? It's like you might be in a group of friends and you are the environmentalist in that friend group. And that's a story you have to embody. And you have to be the one who is always saying, oh, but maybe we could not use single-use plastic at this picnic or whatever else it is. And there's something beautiful about coming into a context in which we can all put down that story in a way, because then we're free to explore the actual stories or the identities that we can bring to this particular movement, right? That's when we get to look in the mirror. Because when you get to step out of the role of being the environmentalist, when you're in an environmental context, for lack of a better term, or a specific ecosystem where you don't have to play that role, then you get to question, well, is my role the photographer? Is it the scientist? Is it the storyteller? And that's where we start to actually look in the mirror and understand what our specific gifts are that we can bring to an ecosystem or a story, the story of this ecosystem we're all a part of that we call the Earth. It's not really a question in there, but it's
I agree and echo with it. I guess, I think also as we, going back to like the shape-shifting thing, like we could have moments in our life that radically redirect what we decide to do. You know, you could be on a corporate path of, you know, your job, and you hear something, or you come to this weekend and you're like, oh my, like, what am I doing? Like, I need to be on a whole, I need to really completely rewrite my story. And I think to live in an ecosystem where people allow you to change your story, I think is really important. And I think like that's a great honor you can give to those that you love around you, to actually allow them to like change their story, change their mind, and not be, oh, I told you so, or oh, really, like that's who you are now. You know, you genuinely like allow them, and like that's what, to me, relationship, the greatest challenge and joy of like being in relationship is that, like truly allowing someone on their own time to change their story. And for me, like with my book or the platform in which I have the privilege to speak on, language is so important to allow someone, never to assume that someone's not trying to change their story. I think sometimes we're often told like, or we go to a business and we're complaining about the fact they're using plastic straws, or who's to know if they're not already trying to shift and change. So not assuming that someone's not already on the path of change and transformation, but like with the platform that I have, like using the right language so that like, it's your idea if you want to change. Like you maybe have told some stories and brought some other people in, but like you need to have the idea to change at the end of the day. Otherwise it's not going to be like honest and truthful. And I think that's really important, that we use, just like the power of like the words and the language and the tone that we have. And that's essentially why my book is called Go Gently, to bring that firm go, like, you know, the immediacy, but the gentle way in which to do that is so important. Otherwise you cannot sustain your action, I don't think. If you do it like, you'll just burn out and you'll crumble and you have all these things. So I think like tone and language, and I think that's what I love about everything that that you write and everything that you have under the umbrella of Atmos and everything that it is. It's like the language, the tone, the sensibilities that you bring to everything is just so beautiful and so needed, in the sense that you're like, I don't know, it just feels vulnerable. Like every piece that is shared just feels really vulnerable. And language, I'm just like learning new words all the time and new ways to look at things. And I think that's so special.
Thank you. Something you said that's really going to stick with me is never assuming that someone isn't trying to change their story. Can we get another one for that? I remember at a certain point in my life learning that there were some languages that don't have a word for personality, because the idea that a person could be static or the same in all situations, in all times, in all contexts in their life is just beyond words. We change so much. Our lives are a story of transition, beginning to end. My book, the overview, Meditations on Nature for a World in Transition. I promise I did write the book. But actually, I did not come up with that title. It was Jake's. So, but part of it touched me so much when he presented the idea for that subtitle was really just that our world it's a story that's constantly in transition, particularly in this particular moment. And we are all worlds in and of ourselves that are constantly in transition. And, we go through that throughout our lives, from birth to death and beyond death. I mean, death itself we could have a whole other panel about death, but death itself is a story, right? We have an idea that a life ends because perhaps consciousness in this iteration ends, but all of the elements that make us up go on to become other things. And we have this idea that death is, it's an end point rather than a point of rebirth. And that's why I love that one of the archetypes for storytelling is rebirth. Rather than death as being the most ingenious invention of nature for reinvention, for actually continuing life, for keeping it going, right? And then when we start to think about death as this incredible, I don't want to say mechanism, but this incredible cycle that we're a part of, it becomes a beautiful story. It becomes the story by which we connect to literally everything else. And suddenly all of our Western conceptions of death as being so annihilating because it's the end of ego start to become less scary. I went into a death spiral.
Love it. And I also think in a small way we can see and connect with that in seasons. Like if we truly allow things to die away and in the winter, and which they do and should, and go to those darker spaces and come back out in that rebirth way in spring, and look at that as our cycle of time, and not obviously the way that we see Monday through Sunday and all these different things. Like how do we and can we, I think, have seasons of stories and through replicate. If we're lost, if I'm lost sometimes, I kind of like reconnect to the season and think how like, oh yeah, of course that's how I'm feeling. Like, it's like that's definitely echoing the fact that I'm in summer or whatever it could be.
And I love the different myths and stories that different cultures have to explain certain elements of nature and the seasons. Does everyone here know the story of Persephone? Anyone? Yes. Okay. Well, I didn't hear enough, so I'm going to tell the story very quickly. But in ancient Greek mythology, Persephone is the daughter of Demeter. So Demeter is the goddess of the harvest and the seasons, and a nature deity, essentially. And her daughter, Persephone, helped her tend to the earth and tend to the fields and keep life thriving. And it said that one day there's a few different versions of the story, but it said that one day she stumbled upon a pomegranate, and she ate from the pomegranate, and that led her to meeting Hades, the king of the underworld. Now, in some versions of the story, he kidnapped her. In other versions of the story, they fell in love, which I do actually think the different versions of that story are relevant, and we'll get there in a second. But ultimately, Demeter wept at the loss of her daughter. And it said that her and Hades had to come into an agreement that for 6 months of the year, Persephone would spend time with her love, Hades, underground. And for the other 6 months, she would spend time above ground. And so for 6 months of the year, Demeter would weep for the loss of her daughter. And nature would weep as well. The trees would lose their leaves, the earth would become barren, and winter would come. And then she would return and come above ground. And once again, everything would bloom. And the reason why I love that particular story is because I do believe that as humans, we all have time spent above ground and below. I think that we all have winters every year. I think we all have winters within our lives. And it's a beautiful reminder from nature that very few things are fixed, and that the seasons can remind us that it's natural sometimes to be in that space, to be in the winter, and that it's actually even possible, I think, to fall in love with it. I mean, a big journey in my life has been learning to fall in love with winter and to just say, this is a time for me to be in solitude, to be reading, to be heavy, to let myself fall back into the earth in some way. And that's all owed to a story. But that also, I think where I'm going with that is, I appreciate what you shared about Atmos and my writing, and I think it highlights that for me, nature is a story in a lot of ways. And when we talk about language, right, stories in some ways are so shaped by language. And words themselves are shapeshifters, right? Obviously, they mean different things in different contexts, and I love what came up on the Oceans panel about Hannah's question of what would happen if we can learn to speak with whales, and what might get lost in translation, right? Are there certain things that cannot be translated? But I love how words, even within one language, can be shapeshifters. I mean, one definition of nature is everything that does not include human beings. And our very first issue of Atmos was the definition, or the theme of the issue was neo-natural, because we were really inspired to start from that linguistic question of, to what sense is in the Western world and in English-speaking places that idea of nature being everything else? In what way does that language separate us, keep us separate? Another definition of nature is the force of everything that has shaped life on Earth and the universe. I mean, could that not also be the definition for what some people call God, what other people call the creator? I mean, so many different names, right? And so a word itself can shapeshift in all of these different contexts. And for me, I've loved engaging with the story of nature, because it's actually the way in which I can write personally, but in a way that's not about me. And I think I touched on this a little bit on Friday, but it's the way I can write about vulnerability, but through the language of frogs, and without actually having to be vulnerable, ?
Yeah.
But it's by finding a language that is common and universal.
Yeah, and that's why we love, why we all have like some character too that we found, a home in. Or even you see children. Why do we dress up? Why do we wear masks? Why do we perform in ways, whether it's, obviously the more hallmark versions of Halloween, or you have something that's more like a carnival, or within your culture, maybe, masks are like this big part of who you show up in community and in circle in storytelling. And like that playful, like becoming someone else for a moment is really, can be very soothing, I think. And that's why I think people, maybe sometimes it's more alive in children, because that like dress up is just normal, and it's something you do every day. You could just have butterfly wings on for months and like gonna go to bed in your butterfly wings if you want, that's fine. And
that was literally me as a child.
So like, I don't know, how do we bring those in? I think obviously the safest ways that we know that is by watching movies, I think, and reading books, because we can be for that moment that character traversing some fantastical world potentially, or maybe some everyday world. But I just think that just going back to the companion piece, like I think people find friends within stories, and find them, feel seen in stories, and that's why they're so important, I think, to pull and give people those pathways, those lifelines that people desperately need. I think particularly in this time that can be so isolating and so much sometimes about a regurgitation of information and not actually a story. I think like so much of what we see online is like information being sort of passed on by others, and then there can be things that are not quite right, and then people can take those as truths, and that's like really scary if they're not told by the right people. And it was talked a bit about in the activism panel, like co-opting language is like, it can be incredibly scary if the kind of polluters of this world are taking language that activists are using and using it to sort of profit again. So I think it's just really important that we listen to the right, or there's not even the right, I think that's the wrong word, but like listen to all storytellers from all perspectives in all spaces within their lifetime too, like intergenerational, storytelling, and like how it could be lovely if, like, you know, your grandma told you a story, and then how you as a child, like, told that to your friend in the playground is, like, kind of going to be cool, like, how that changed. So, yeah, I think there's so much opportunity, I think, for storytelling to come out of this, like, information age, that, like, we can, like, put the heart back into it and the humanity back into it.
Completely. And I want to ask just one more question, because I want to leave space for everyone to ask questions. But something that's come up a few different times is this wisdom you shared around imagination within storytelling, and why that's so important in a climate context. And that stories really are a portal for change or understanding what's possible, right? You know, whether it's a story of climate resilience, or a story about literal magic. I mean, I think stories are these portals for creating change in a world, and I can't imagine anything more magic than that. I'm curious for you, what stories do you feel like are not being told right now in the climate space, or stories related to our relationship with the earth that you want to see more of, and what role can we all sort of play in bringing imagination into the stories that we all interact with every day?
Oh, yeah.
It's a very small question
really small, tiny
end.
thing. Yeah, I feel like portals is a great, like, word to play with. You know, everyone that's spoken this weekend has taken us to some, you know, portal of their own, through sharing, or through the, you know, a big way in for me into this space of genuinely terrified for our climate was always for me coastal communities and environments and ocean. Like, that was my way into this. And so just earlier, like, talking about these deep, high seas, and, like, the absolute terror that we can have towards, like, what could happen out of the, you know, arena and eyes of the world, like, things that can happen, and, like, why it's so important that storytellers take us to that deep sea environment and tell us the story of those places, even if it's a story of mystery, because it pretty much is, because we're not quite sure what's down there, but that's, like, a great story. Like, if we bring in some characters of what lays beneath those deep oceans, like, that is going to connect on way more of a, you know, reality than, like, a fact. Like we were talking about, like, hearing the scary truth of, like, 3% of our oceans are currently, you know, protected, and we need 30%. Like, that's, like, wait, that's hard to even, like, sometimes comprehend. So how do we, you know, if that's a space that we care about and we're worried about, like, how do we maybe tell the story of that deep sea, and what characters kind of come up for us? But I guess for me, I think from a storytelling perspective, like, there's been many stories that I've been working on for a while. A lot of them include monsters.
Our favorite kind of story.
Because I'm a lover of monster movies and horror and sci-fi and stuff like that. And that's, like, where I, like, love to be as an audience member. So I'm trying to see if I can be a storyteller within that genre myself, bringing in, obviously, the monster of being humans, like, or the, you know, where we are, or the 1%, or whoever that monster could be. But I think what's more important to me in this moment personally than the story I'm telling is, like, who I'm telling it with. Is the main thing I'm sort of, like, grappling with right now, as collaborative as storytelling and filmmaking particularly is. I've kind of gone through an era in my life of sort of, like, going inwards and having my own kind of winter, and obviously writing a book during, you know, the COVID pandemic was, as you can imagine, a very solitary experience. And probably if I didn't have that container, maybe I would never have written that book. So that was great too. But now I'm in an era, I feel, in my life where it is actually looking at who my collaborators are, and, like, opening those boundaries up so that we co-create those stories and tell those stories. Because, like, a story I may have just personally to tell probably just not that interesting, not as interesting it would be if I co-created it with others. So that's kind of the space I'm in, and right now I'm kind of looking to who that is and how I find that. And there's been some moments in my life in the past couple of days and weeks that, you know, in a weird way, people have kind of come to me with that desire to collaborate, and it's really interesting, I find, when you put that like energy out and then it comes back. So I feel like it's already happening in this moment, and sort of shifting my narrative and the narratives I want to tell based on who I'm telling them with is basically the theme of my days right now. But what that story could be, maybe it is still the monster story, but maybe it's something completely different.
Well, I personally hope that you do make some kind of climate monster movie. I really did not.
It's been written, it just needs to be made.
Okay, there we go. Insider scoop. I never really had an appreciation for horror films in that genre until my brother does screenwriting, and he shared with me once that horror films are how people in some ways process trauma by seeing it externalized, what they feel internally. And that completely changed how I saw that genre. And I think there's a fair amount of trauma in the world that could be processed, especially related to climate. So I hope you tell that story. It's been a joy to co-create with you up here. Thank you so much for being here. Questions? Jake?
Yeah, it's awesome.
I'm entrepreneurial. I have a million ideas a minute in my head of let me start this, start that. And when you
Can confirm.
and when you were sharing about the stories in your head, and I was thinking, oh, you probably have 1,000 stories in your head. You know what you want to create. And when we're living in a world where there's so many multifaceted issues and areas to lean into, that our projects or stories can, you know, intertwine with and support, what's the process for deciding this is the one? This is worth focusing on and not being spread thin around.
Well, firstly, I would say that I think there's a lot of similarities between entrepreneurs and storytellers, and I've found myself sometimes feeling entrepreneurial in moments of like trying to find the medium to tell the story. It can be quite entrepreneurial in the sense that that could be in other people's industry, the product or the service or whatever, you know, ends up being the medium to best contain that idea. So I think for me, when I think about that, sometimes it's so quick and fast, like, yep, that was great idea, but like that's just going to stay in that moment, even to the fact that I'm not going to tell anyone about that story. Like that needs to truly stay within my body. But I think sometimes it can take a really long time to realize that actually that's not the story. And I think it's really important, or I've found it's taken me a long time to realize that all that time I grappled with trying to think how I would tell that story is never wasted time. And like that helped me tell the next story. And I think my experience, when I've made, you know, certain films and short films, and, you know, you're constantly thinking like, is this going to be another kind of portfolio piece, or is this going to be the piece that kind of helps me step to the next place that I'm trying to get to? And I feel like through my 20s, and I feel like a lot of people can feel this maybe, is it constantly feels like you're just making more and more sort of like learning pieces and portfolio pieces. And for me, that really angered me for a long time, because I felt like all the energy I put into it, it's just going to be like another piece that people are like, well, you know, it's just part of the journey and that's going to help you get to the next story. And that really like angered me, I think. But finally getting to that place where I could truly like feel for myself that wasn't a wasted story is kind of like the only other way I can like talk about this too, is like, I think it is love, in the idea that sometimes you know, separate with someone and you feel like, oh my God, all that I just shared, all of myself I just shared with that person is now lost. And that's not true, obviously. That love that you gave to that person is going to come back around, and it's like part of a collective pool. And I think that's how I try and think about like stories, and the ones and ways I try to complete the story. And I often see them as circles. Like I see a lot of like completed projects visually in circles, and sometimes they're incomplete circles, and having to be okay with some incomplete circles and knowing that that can just land where it is, and it like helps me to write the next one. So I think if something doesn't bore you and you sit with it for a long time, then I think that's a good sign that this is probably going to be interesting to someone else. I think if you already get like frustrated by it or kind of just like not interested in waking up to like explore that project, like it probably isn't the right story. But I think just being okay with the fact that things can just end completed. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think just know that like the energy given to each of these brilliant ideas you're thinking of each day, like are all culminating to something, even if you can't like name it. And I think being okay that you can do all of it, like, and it's still a story if you just was an idea, I think, or it's still a like entrepreneurial idea, even if it is just an idea, because that's like the way you think.
And I love the idea of the unfinished circles too, almost being like more like concentric circles, right? Where like it might overlap in some way with a different story that you do see to completion, whatever that means, because you learn something from it about yourself as a storyteller, or about how to approach another story that might be similar. And that's how the stories start to overlap and become these kind of concentric circles that build out in some way. I'm not an entrepreneur, though, so I don't know. Other questions? Yeah.
I would love to know what maybe one or a few of the fictional characters that you grew up with that inspired, and this extends to both of you, like inspired who you are or the work that you do.
Yeah. Listening to the story, there's so many whale stories today. It reminded me of a film that came out in like the early 2000s, Whale Rider, that was set in New Zealand about Maori people of that country, and this one young girl that overcomes so much and connects with obviously the spirit of these whales. And like I totally forgotten about that story, and I absolutely loved it when it came out. And it was just interesting like hearing today people's like moments of connection in the ocean, and how for me, as however old I was in that moment, like that story enabled me to truly believe that you can be and have a relationship to a whale, and like how that would have been massively influential to me in that moment, that like that was a character in the story and it was as important as the young girl in that story. So just I think moments to me where place or landscape has taken up as much space as a character has been the stories that I've always loved, and has been very much a theme within my work all the way back from when I was at film school. Like literally my dissertation final piece in my final year was literally about how character, nature is a character within story, and that's still pretty much what I'm like doing 12 years later from graduating. So it's always been for me, like looking to landscape and place and potentially, other species and animal being as part of a character. So yeah, weirdly, I've always like found myself loving stories. And that's also why I love like animation and children's stories, because often the voiceless of the animal gets a voice, and sometimes not always in the right way, but sometimes in great ways too.
I mean, similarly for me, when I was a kid, I loved stories of non-human animals, and I wasn't kidding about the butterfly wings. Like when I was a kid, I would put on a costume of another animal and I would just be that for like a month. And my parents would be like, no, you have to change. You have to go to school. And I would be like, no. And it's not lost on me that now I get to write about different animals every week, and there's a complete circle there somehow. But rather than a specific human character, I think what's coming up for me is a movie or a story that really changed my life, which is, has anyone in the room seen the movie Arrival? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyone? Yes. Okay. You have also been changed by Arrival. Yeah, I mean, I guess Bio and I both have like stories involving aliens, and I am also maybe going to spoil part of it similarly. But so much of that film is about how we understand our relationship to time, and understanding time as not being linear but circular. And the really brilliant part of that film is that the way one shifts their view of time is through language, is through learning a different language. And I won't spoil the specifics of it, but and I remember being struck by how meta that was, because I think also watching that film, watching that story about a language changing how you saw time, like that story was a language in and of itself, and it changed how I saw time. And it was this, it's kind of a story within a story. And yeah, I think that really opened my mind to the idea that time as a linear construct is a story. It's a story by which many of us live our lives, and it's something that we assume and we take as fact. But there are other ways of understanding time and other conceptions of it. So that's a story that really changed my life. Other questions? Yeah?
About storytelling, Bonnie, you mentioned something about the first 10 minutes, that formula, and I'm wondering how much you see like the time restrictions of the formulas of storytelling, whether it be one of the 7 stories, or as a result of good storytelling or more like cultural change. Like, does it seem like that 10 minutes is like 9 minutes and 8 minutes is getting shorter? How much like our attention and the time we have plays into that formula?
Yeah, I guess that formula, as I mentioned, is kind of a formula that people use when you talk about like the hero's journey, and how you use that as a format to writing film, and that first 10 minutes of that moment happening. But I wonder too, because weirdly, as things have become shorter to some extent with stories, feature-length films can now be like 2 parts, 3 hours long each. So I there's kind of like a kind of expanding and like reducing idea of like what we think our audience will sit through and still be comfortable and happy and, you know, everything. So I'm always like interested in like what came first. Was it the audience's desire to be told a story in a shorter amount of time? Or was it the storytellers, the producers that decided that our attention should, you know, I just wonder like what came first, like neither, because I think they're all going in different ways. But I guess it's also with all those frameworks, even the archetypes that we were just talking about, it's also listening and hearing them, but also ripping up that bit of paper and throwing it away and doing your own thing too, I think is really important. And I think, you know, I can come across other collaborators who really, they like the theory book, they like to hit those points, you know, exactly as those, you know, teachings are told. And I've always been someone who like likes to hear everything, but like then like put it behind. Like I'll write loads of things, but I probably won't ever read the notes again. So I think it's also just having your interpretation of that. And I think also to someone to come in and say that there's only 7 stories, that could be like, well, no, like, yeah, and that's okay to like disagree, I think. And I think maybe the culture that you come from would very much disagree with that reality. And like, are those archetypes also like a construct in a Western kind of way? And did those come from, you know, myths of certain civilizations that really were those first recorded stories? They obviously, myths in some eras aren't, but they weren't the first story. They just maybe the ones that were written down. So I think that's important to sort of like think about. Like they can be frameworks that can be helpful, but they could also really like hold you back too, I think.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Do we? One more? Alice says yes. So.
Bonnie, something that you said earlier really resonated with me, and I believe what you said was that it has to be their idea. It has to be, you know, you're talking about the language that we use in storytelling, and that, you know, people deciding to change it. It has to be their idea, and it really resonated for me because I think throughout the weekend, you know, a question that's been coming up a lot is, what can I do? And what I've heard, my interpretation of what I've been hearing hearing is that we all have to do some amount of contemplation to reflect on what we can contribute, what we can do. And you also mentioned that, we've been receiving a lot of stories, and there is a need to assimilate, and I think if we do this again, thinking about how we can build in some assimilation kind of.
Planting a seed.
So with that, my question is, for both of you, is there a question that we can all ask ourselves, like almost like a journaling instruction or a contemplation question that we can ask ourselves? This is our last talk of the weekend that we can go home with, so that we can each reflect on, how we can each have our own great idea of what we can do, what we want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Bonnie gave me the over to you look. I think, something Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, a question she often asks is, what is my superpower? And, how can I apply that to this particular moment? And I always love that question because I think that's where we arrive at kind of our sense of vocation. She has a whole Venn diagram around it, and I think that came up on the activism panel. But the first part of your question, what question can we walk away with, or can we ask ourselves? I think the first thing that came to mind is we have all heard so many stories this weekend, and I wonder what it might look like to ask yourself, who are the people in my life that some of these different stories might resonate with? Because I think that's how stories live, and that's how stories go from being seeds to something that sprouts and grows, is allowing them to be tended by many hands. And I think stories can reach people in such personal and specific ways. And in my head, I'm thinking about, okay, I know the story of the leopard seal will reach this one specific person in my life, right? Or I have a friend who works in film, and I know that what Bonnie shared around stories as companions will really reach that person. So I think starting to tap into the mycelial networks that we are a part of, the relationships that we carry, and allowing these stories to be transported through them, to allow them to live on and grow from here. I think that's how this work spreads, and I think that's how it changes. And we came up with the tagline for this weekend, "In gathering we grow," and I think really that comes down to stories. I think they are the funnels through which that happens, that change and that growth happens. So maybe that's a question we can start with.
Love all of everything you said. I think for me, you kind of just said it in the title of "In Gathering We Grow." I think really like absorbing all this energy. This energy feels really good to be amongst other people and to hear people's stories, and everyone shared a piece of themselves. Even just your presence of sitting in this room is a piece of you, and like really trying to like take in that energy as a way to, I think, like lift yourself up. I think sometimes people can sit on a stage, and yes, we're the ones sitting right here with a microphone, and it's great that, that you can see the person and listen to the person with the microphone, and somehow start losing confidence in your story, or, maybe, I don't have a moment where I was deep in the ocean diving with, these incredible animals. I haven't experienced that. So obviously that can sometimes have like different reactions to it. You can either be inspired by it or intimidated by that story. So I think like that's a welcome emotion too. And I think to spend a moment, like we said, like which we don't often do, to digest the stories. And I think, I hope that people can feel that the energy that they gathered from this weekend can be a way to lift themselves up and have confidence and, self-worth of their story and their skill sets, and really taking it back to whatever scale you want to take it to. I think like Could be maybe for a couple of months you're just working on the scale of like your internal world. Could be you're ready to talk amongst your family, your students that you are at school with, those you work with, your colleagues. Maybe it's your town, your community, your village, your city. Maybe it's like global. Like, see where like are you going to take that energy for now? I think is really important, because like we're talking a lot about context too. Like, if you just commit your life to local work, that's incredible too. You don't have to take it to a global place or space. So yeah, I just hope that you notice the energy and like maybe name it, like what you're feeling like from this weekend, and like take that and not like lose that energy and momentum, and maybe just see where you want to be uplifted yourself or uplift others, to not feel like, to have a positive reaction to this. Because I feel like for me, a lot of people I meet feel genuinely intimidated to start somewhere. And that is a true emotion that shouldn't be discarded as lazy or thinking that like, oh, come on, like you've got your thing. Like, that's a true emotion to feel intimidated. So like, how do we create pathways so that people don't feel like that? And so, yeah, I would just take it back to a scale that works for you too. And it doesn't have to be sat behind any type of microphone, like we have our own ways to speak, and that could be through our words, it could be through our body, through our hands, through like all different ways.
And that it's okay also for it to feel overwhelming. I mean, we all have absorbed so much this weekend, and after this we'll be doing a sound bath right outside, and I think it will be a really beautiful opportunity to kind of let everything settle, and giving yourself that permission to pause and let yourself absorb everything. And I had a teacher once tell me to just trust that everything that you were meant to absorb, you will have absorbed. And just let yourself sit with that, and before you start to share and give it to the world.
And I think know that it is already happening. Like, I think often like, I want to be more like you are like that, and it is like it's happening for everyone. We're in this room. Like it's the story is, we're in it.
Every single person in this room is a storyteller. And that's what I truly love about this subject, is that it is what we all have in common. We are constantly telling stories every day. So with that,
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.